moral philosophical reasoning for that? Is it okay to have the tool so as long as I don't use it?
Yeah, well, I don't know whether there are philosophical reasons, and I'm very conscious of getting into deep water here, and trying desperately to keep it on, on philosophical topics and not talk about things I don't know anything about. But I mean, I think the answer in principle is yes. I mean, if you accept the principle of the UN Charter of resistance to a defence against aggression, then clearly that has the implication that it's legitimate to have armed forces to deter aggression. Now, the concept of deterrence, I think, how shall I put it, was degraded by the argument about nuclear deterrence. And I never accepted the case for nuclear deterrence, because the whole idea of nuclear deterrence is that nuclear deterrence deters, maybe it does deter, but it deters only if you're prepared to use nuclear weapons. As I try to argue, the use of nuclear weapons never would be justified. So the idea of nuclear deterrence seems to be not to be morally acceptable at all. And the problem is that people tend then, because of all the talk, especially in the 1980s, that went on, and still does, I guess, about the need to have nuclear weapons as a deterrent, that I think seems to undermine the very idea of deterrence. But the idea of deterrence in itself is legitimate if the deterrence consists in being prepared to use weapons in ways which could themselves be morally legitimate as a way of trying to prevent them ever being used. Now, the doctrine that some things in this area have over the years tried to develop is the idea of genuinely defensive deterrence. And again, I'm no expert on this and what the military implications would be. But if the form of military deterrence that you adopt to try to prevent aggression is one that's strictly defensive, that doesn't carry with it a capacity to attack other countries, then it's much more likely to act as a deterrent and to keep the peace. If, in the name of deterrence, your country's military forces include aircraft carriers and bombers and tanks and so on, the kind of military forces that would typically be used for the invasion of another country, then the signals that it's going to send to other countries are that this country is a country that is prepared to contemplate aggression. On the other hand, if the military forces that you deploy as a deterrent are things like anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles and so on, which can only be used in a defensive capacity, then that is the kind of deterrence which may be legitimate and may effectively help to keep the peace rather than to undermine it.
We have two more questions that we have time for. You are arguing that war and military aggression are not a good solution. So what, if any, are the moral alternatives? Economic sanctions, for instance, can also kill civilians.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the deterrents in part are, the sorts of things that Professor Galton has talked about and is so much of an expert on, about how you prevent getting into the situation in the first place where you seem to have no alternative. I agree that economic sanctions are not nice. They very often economic sanctions kill people as well as military action. There is an honourable tradition of non-violent resistance, and I don't need any Norwegian audience to talk about the role that non-violent resistance can play, as for example during the occupation by the Nazis, the refusal by the teachers to implement the Nazi curriculum. And there are plenty of other examples of how non-violent resistance can play a role. One writer on non-violent resistance, I remember, said, people ridicule the idea of non-violent resistance. How can you possibly hope to defeat a heavily armed enemy just with non-violent methods? And part of the answer is because we've not developed techniques of non-violent resistance, we've not trained people for it, we've not built up a culture for it. It's like somebody looking at the first aeroplane and saying, how can you ever expect that to cross the Atlantic or even get from one end of one field to the other? It's crazy to rely on that. It's not crazy to rely on it, it was just that hadn't been developed. So likewise, if we were to take seriously the idea of non-violent resistance and make it an integral part of a country's legitimate policy of deterrence against aggression, then it might go a long way to prevent conflict from aggression.
Okay, the final question then is that democratic states have never found any just cause to go to war with any other democracy. There are always non-democratic states involved in every war. Might the simple solution be the global establishment of democracy to end all wars? It's not a yes or no question.
Is it historically true? I mean, it raises. I guess I'm going to evade it as a philosopher and say it depends what you mean by democracy. That's not. I'm sorry, that's the cop out.
Okay. But thanks anyway. Thank you very much for contributing.